Alexander Carter, a successful and confident businessman, was driving through the park one ordinary morning when he encountered a homeless woman. What he didn't know at the time was that this meeting would not only change her life, but also his, forever. It was a calm, sunny morning when Alexander Carter, a man who seemed to have everything his heart desired, made a decision that would change his life forever. Not through some grand gesture, but through a moment so subtle it almost went unnoticed. A chance beginning that would unexpectedly cut deep. Alexander's days were usually a carefully orchestrated sequence of meetings, deals, and encounters with the most powerful people in the city. As the CEO of a tech empire, he had achieved the kind of success most people could only dream of. But the truth behind his perfect facade? It was a life filled with repetition and emptiness. No matter how much he achieved, he felt more like a spectator in his own existence. That morning, for no clear reason, he had given his chauffeur the day off. For the first time in years, he was behind the wheel himself. Maybe it was a fleeting need to feel in control, or maybe it was just a whim. Either way, he took an unplanned detour through the city park, a place he rarely visited. As he drove along the gravel path, his gaze fell on a figure that made him instinctively hit the brakes. On a worn-out bench beneath a bare tree sat a woman. Her frail figure was wrapped in an oversized coat that seemed to swallow her whole, and her dark hair hung like a curtain over her face. She didn't move, her gaze fixed on the ground, as if the world around her didn't exist. There was nothing particularly striking about her, yet Alexander felt a strange, unexplainable weight in his chest. He parked his car a short distance away and got out. As he approached the bench, he noticed his heart beating faster. Who was she? What was she doing here alone? And why did he feel this inexplicable urge to understand her story? "Good morning," he said cautiously as he came closer. His voice sounded more formal than he had intended. This wasn't his world. This wasn't the realm of elegant dinners and gilded boardrooms. He suddenly felt like an intruder. The woman slowly looked up. Her eyes were sharp and guarded, as if she already knew everything about him. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone leaving no room for interpretation. There was nothing warm or inviting about her demeanor. Alexander hesitated, unaccustomed to such direct rejection. I saw you sitting here," he began, searching for words, "and I wondered if you were okay." She let out a short, bitter laugh, as if the mere idea was absurd. "Do you think I'm sitting here because I have nothing better to do?" He felt his cheeks flush. When was the last time someone had treated him with such indifference? "I meant well," he said eventually. "Maybe I just wanted to help." She scoffed and shook her head. "People like you never help for no reason," she retorted sharply. "What do you want from me?" Alexander didn't know the answer himself. What was he doing here? He was used to control, to clarity, but here, with this woman, everything felt different. Yet he stayed, driven by something he couldn't explain. "Maybe nothing," he admitted. "Maybe I don't even know why I stopped." The woman continued to stare at him, her eyes now less sharp, but still cautious. Finally, she said simply, "Emma, that's my name." Her words were straightforward, but to Alexander they felt like a small victory. He nodded. "I'm Alexander," he introduced himself, trying to catch her gaze. What Alexander didn't know was that this meeting would mark the beginning of something much greater than he could have ever imagined. A chain of events that would change not only his life, but hers as well, forever. Alexander had left his car that morning without knowing exactly why. But that night, as he stood in his luxurious penthouse overlooking the glittering city skyline, one thing became clear. He couldn't get her out of his mind. Who was Emma? Why did it feel like her silence spoke louder than the words she didn't say? He downed his third glass of whiskey and felt a strange restlessness. This wasn't normal. He, a man who was always in control, suddenly felt unsettled. It wasn't just curiosity, it was something more. The next morning, he parked at the park again, this time carrying 2 cups of coffee in his hands. As he approached the bench, he saw her sitting there once more, wrapped in that same oversized coat. The air was cold and her posture closed off, but he couldn't help wondering, what weight was she carrying that seemed to press her so heavily to the ground? "Good morning," he began, holding up the coffee. "I thought you might like something warm." Emma looked up. Her gaze was still sharp, but there was something else. Hesitation. Exhaustion. Eventually, she accepted the cup without a word. She wrapped her hands around it, holding it tightly, as though the warmth didn't just reach her fingers, but something deeper inside her. "Thank you," she mumbled at last, her voice softer than he had expected. Alexander sat at the other end of the bench, keeping a respectful distance. He looked at the trees in front of them, their bare branches swaying gently in the wind. "Why do you sit here every day?" he asked after a moment. His tone was cautious, almost hesitant. Emma turned her face away from him and remained silent for a few seconds. "Where else would I go?" she finally replied, without looking at him. Those words lingered. They sounded simple, but Alexander heard more in them. Loneliness, hopelessness, perhaps even despair. Why did he feel such a deep urge to understand her better? "Do you have family?" he asked carefully. "Or friends? Someone who can help you?" Emma's expression changed immediately. She turned to face him, her eyes sharp once again. "Why do you want to know? What does it matter to you?" Alexander swallowed and looked away. "Maybe I just want to understand how I can help," he answered honestly. Emma let out a short, mocking laugh. "People like you don't understand people like me." Alexander felt a sting of frustration. He wanted to argue, to explain that he genuinely wanted to help, but he knew it wouldn't change anything. Still, he stayed, determined not to walk away. But why? Why did it feel like he already knew her, as if their paths had always been meant to cross? After a few minutes of silence, Emma spoke again. Her voice was softer now, almost fragile. "I had a life," she began. "I was a nurse. It was my calling. But when my mother got sick, I had to take care of her. It felt like my duty." Alexander remained silent, afraid to interrupt her. He sensed that she was about to share something important. "When she died, I had nothing left," she continued, her gaze fixed on the ground. "My savings were gone. I lost my job because I had been away too long. And my fiancé, he couldn't wait for me to get my life back on track." Alexander didn't know what to say. Her words were heavy, filled with loss and pain. But what struck him most was her tone, not bitter but exhausted, as if she had already given up on trying to reclaim anything. Who was this woman really? And why did her story feel strangely intertwined with his own? "I'm sorry," he said at last. He knew it wasn't enough, but he had to say something. Emma shrugged as if it didn't matter. "It is what it is." The silence between them felt heavy, yet oddly familiar. Alexander sensed there was more, that her story wasn't finished. But he also knew he couldn't force her to tell him. Not yet. "I have to go," Emma said suddenly. She stood and pulled her coat tighter around her. "Thanks for the coffee." Alexander watched her walk away. He wanted to stop her, to ask her to stay. But he remained seated, his hands still wrapped around his own coffee cup. He knew this wouldn't be their last meeting. But what he didn't know was that the truth she carried would also uncover parts of his own past. The next morning, Alexander found himself back at the park. The gravel crunched beneath his shoes as he approached the bench where he had seen Emma over the past few days. But today she wasn't there. The bench was empty, and a slight chill ran down his spine. Why did her absence feel heavier than he expected? He waited for a moment, his gaze fixed on the bare trees, as if they could offer him a clue. After a while, he gave up. Maybe she had decided not to see him again. But deep down, he knew there was more to it. Later that day, back in his penthouse, Alexander tried to focus on work. Emails poured in, phones rang incessantly, but nothing could distract him from thoughts of Emma. Who was she, really? What was she carrying that cut so deeply? And why couldn't he let go of the things she had told him about her mother, her fiancé, and the pain in her voice as she spoke? Had their encounter affected him by chance? Or was there a deeper reason why she was so impossible to forget? He had to know. He couldn't leave it alone. That evening, he decided to take action. The next morning, Alexander drove to a place he would normally never visit, a shelter on the outskirts of the city. It was a drab building with peeling paint and a worn sign that read, "Welcome to those with nowhere else to go." As he walked to the door, he felt like an outsider. This wasn't his world, but maybe it was Emma's. Inside, it was warm, but the air was heavy with the smell of old furniture and damp walls. Alexander looked around, searching for a familiar face. "Can I help you, sir?" a woman asked gently. She wore a badge with the name Sophia. "I'm looking for someone," Alexander replied. "A young woman. Her name is Emma. Dark hair, slender build. I've seen her at the park." Sophia's expression softened. "Emma? Yes, she came in this morning. She didn't seem well and is resting now. She had a rough night." Alexander felt a wave of relief mixed with concern. What had happened? And why hadn't she said anything when he saw her the day before? "Can I see her?" he asked. The volunteer hesitated for a moment. "We try to limit visitors, but I'll ask if she wants to see you. Please wait here." After a few minutes, Sophia returned and nodded. "She'll see you, but she's very tired. Please keep it brief." Alexander followed her down a narrow hallway to a small room. There, on a metal bed with a thin blanket, lay Emma. Her face was pale and her eyes were heavy with exhaustion. But when she saw him, a flicker of recognition crossed her face. "Alexander," she said softly. Her voice was weaker than he had expected. "What are you doing here?" "I was worried," he admitted, sitting in a chair next to her bed. "You weren't at the park yesterday, and I wanted to make sure you were okay." Emma gave a faint smile. "Okay? That's a word I haven't used in a long time." Alexander leaned forward, his gaze serious. "Emma, what's going on? What are you trying to hide from me?" Emma's smile faded and she turned her gaze away. "You don't want to know," she said quietly. "It's not your problem." "Maybe not," he replied, "but I want it to be my problem." His voice sounded more sincere than he expected. Why did he feel such a deep need to help her, as if her pain somehow mirrored his own? Emma remained silent for a moment before speaking. "I'm sick," she finally said, "not just on the inside, but physically too. Sometimes I can't function. Sometimes my body just doesn't do what it's supposed to. That's why I lost my job. No one wants to hire someone who can't show up for days at a time." Alexander felt a lump in his throat as he listened to her. "Why didn't you tell anyone? Why are you trying to carry this all alone?" Emma shrugged, her gaze still fixed on the ceiling. "Because no one else has ever done it for me." Those words cut deeper than Alexander had expected. He wanted to argue, to convince her that it didn't have to be that way. But he knew he had to earn her trust first. "Emma," he said gently, "you don't have to do this alone. Let me help you." She turned her head to look at him, her eyes no longer defensive, but vulnerable. "Why?" she asked. "Why would someone like you even care about someone like me?" Alexander hesitated for a moment before answering. "Because I believe everyone deserves a second chance, and because I think you're much stronger than you realize." Emma gave a faint smile, but her eyes still held doubt. "Maybe," she whispered before closing her eyes again. As Alexander sat there, listening to her steady breathing, he felt a growing determination within him. But what he didn't know was that his desire to help her wasn't just about her. There was a past he had yet to uncover, a past that connected their lives in ways he never could have imagined. In the days that followed, Alexander visited the park every morning. He hoped to see Emma there again, just like the first time. But each time he arrived, he found only empty benches and still trees. Why did her absence feel heavier than it should? He tried to force himself to move on, to stop looking for her, but something held him back. Maybe it was her story or the way she looked at him, a mixture of distrust and vulnerability that he couldn't shake. Eventually, he decided to return to the shelter. When he arrived, he saw Sophia, the volunteer he had met before. She gave him a faint smile of recognition. "She's here," Sophia said, before he could even ask. "But she's different today." Alexander followed her down the hallway, where the air was thick with the scent of warm soup and damp walls. Sophia stopped in front of a small room and knocked softly on the door. When she opened it, Alexander saw Emma sitting at a table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Her eyes were fixed downward, as if she were trying to organize her thoughts. "Emma," Alexander began gently as he stepped inside. She looked up, her face pale, but her eyes betrayed a wariness he now recognized. "You're here again," she said, her voice flat. Why? I was worried, he admitted, sitting across from her at the table. You've been quiet these past few days. Emma took a sip of her tea and looked at him over the rim of the mug. Being quiet is easier than talking, she said simply. Alexander leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Maybe it is, but that doesn't mean it's better. An awkward silence followed. Emma stared into her mug, as if wrestling with words she didn't want to say. Finally, she broke the silence. Why are you doing this? She asked. Her voice was sharper than she intended. Why do you keep coming back? Alexander hesitated. What could he say that wouldn't sound like a cliché? Because I think there's more to your story, he said finally, and because I don't want you to think no one cares. Emma let out a mocking laugh, but it didn't sound genuine. People like you don't just care about people like me. Maybe not, he admitted, but I want to be different. Her eyes narrowed, as if she were weighing his words. Why? She asked sharply. Why do you want to be different? What's hiding behind your shiny facade, Alexander Carter? Her question hit him harder than he expected. He felt a lump in his throat as he searched for the right words. Why did he want her to see him for who he truly was? Maybe, he began softly, because I carry things too. Things no one else has ever seen. Emma's gaze remained fixed on him, her distrust evident. Like what? Alexander took a deep breath and met her eyes. Like the feeling that everything I've built means nothing. Like the realization that I'm lonely, despite everything I have. And maybe, he added, like the idea that I've finally found someone who understands what that feels like. His words brought another uneasy silence to the room. Emma looked at him, her eyes softer now, but still full of doubt. Why did it feel like her questions revealed as much about her as they did about him? I don't know what to believe, she said finally. I don't know if I can trust you. Alexander nodded, a faint smile on his face. I understand. But what if I show you that you can? Emma leaned back in her chair, her hand still firmly around the mug. She said nothing, but Alexander knew he had been given her silent permission. That evening, back in his penthouse, Alexander felt the restlessness rise within him again. He paced back and forth in the living room as the city below him came to life. Why did he feel so responsible for her? And why did it seem like she carried something that also touched his own past? His eyes fell on a file on his desk, a file he had compiled months ago. It was a collection of reports about Joris, his former business partner and the man who had betrayed him. Alexander knew that Joris hadn't just hurt him, he had destroyed other lives as well. And one of those lives was Emma's. He opened the file and looked at the first page. There, in the middle of the report, was her name, Emma. Her past was inextricably linked to his, in a way he didn't yet fully understand. What should he do with this? Should he tell her that he knew more about her than he had let on? Or would that jeopardize everything they had started to build? But how long could he hope to earn her trust while keeping a secret of his own? The next day, Alexander saw her again, but not in the way he had expected. She was walking through a busy street in the city, her shoulders hunched against the cold, her gaze fixed firmly on the ground. He hesitated for a moment, but decided to follow her from a distance. Her posture was closed, her steps hurried. Why did it feel like something had changed? She stopped in front of a shop window and stood still. Alexander stayed in the shadows, his breathing heavy with uncertainty. In the window was an old black and white photograph of a small cafe. It looked like an ordinary scene, but the way Emma was looking at it told a different story. He decided he couldn't just stand and watch any longer. Emma, he said softly as he walked toward her. She flinched slightly, turned around, and her eyes filled with the now familiar mix of surprise and defensiveness. Alexander, she replied flatly, you just can't help yourself, can you? Maybe I can't, he admitted, but I saw you standing here and it seemed like this meant something to you. She glanced back at the photo, her eyes tracing its details. That's a place where my mother used to work, she said at last, her voice soft, almost fragile. She was a waitress there. We lived around the corner. Alexander followed her gaze, his own thoughts silent. The cafe in the photo was small and unassuming. far removed from the world of luxury he inhabited. "What happened?" he asked carefully. Emma's face hardened, her gaze dropping to the ground. "The cafe closed. After that, things went downhill quickly." She turned to him, her eyes once again guarded. "I need to go." She left him standing there, the silence of her absence heavier than he had expected. Later that evening, Alexander sat in his penthouse, the file on his desk in front of him. He had had this information for weeks, but had never summoned the courage to confront it. Now it felt like he had no choice. What he was about to uncover would change everything. But could he bring himself to show it to Emma? He opened the file and began to read. Names, dates, events, all pointed to a connection between Joris and Emma's past. One document stood out. It detailed a business dispute in which Joris had made a ruthless decision, the closure of a small cafe. But the repercussions went far beyond a shuttered business. The cafe had been Emma's home base. Her mother had worked there, but when it closed, they lost everything: her job, their home, their stability. Alexander felt a cold shiver run down his spine. This was more than coincidence. Fate hadn't just brought them together. Joris had bound them in the worst possible way. The next morning, Alexander waited for her at the park. He didn't bring coffee or a smile, just the file clutched tightly in his hand. He spotted her from a distance, her slender figure wrapped in that familiar coat. She looked up as he approached, her expression instantly wary. "Emma," he began, sitting next to her on the bench, "I need to tell you something." She narrowed her eyes, her tone sharp. "What is it now?" "Another good deed from the great Alexander Carter." He swallowed. "No, this isn't about helping. It's about things you need to know." Emma leaned back slightly, her arms crossed. "What kind of things?" she asked slowly, her tone hard, but her eyes betraying a flicker of uncertainty. Alexander took a deep breath and handed her the file. His fingers trembled as he spoke. "Here, I think you should see it. It's better if you read it yourself." Emma hesitated, her gaze shifting between him and the file. Finally, she took it and began flipping through the pages. Her eyes narrowed as she read, her breathing quickening with each page. Halfway through, she suddenly stopped. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling as if she could barely get the words out. Alexander looked at the ground, his throat dry. "It's about Joris," he began. "About what he did and how it affected your life." Emma turned to him slowly, her gaze hard and intense. "Why did you know this? How long have you known?" Her voice cut through the cold air. He swallowed again and forced himself to meet her eyes. "I found out months ago, but I didn't know how to tell you. I wanted to help you without making you have to know this." "Have to know what?" she repeated, her tone icy. "What aren't you telling me, Alexander? What else is there?" He rubbed his hands over his face as if trying to summon the courage he needed. "It's not just about Joris," he said finally. "It's about me, about things I didn't dare to admit before." Emma froze. What did he mean? What was he still hiding? She stood up, the file clutched tightly to her chest. Her expression was no longer defensive, but filled with something else. Something Alexander couldn't quite place. "I don't know what to do with this," she said, "but one thing I know for sure, I don't want any more lies." "Emma, wait," Alexander said quickly, rising to his feet. "I want to be honest. I do. But there are things I couldn't even admit to myself. Please give me a chance to make this right." She turned slowly, her gaze soft but resolute. "Maybe. But I'm the one who decides if it can be made right, not you." With those words, she walked away. Alexander remained behind, his hands buried in his pockets as the morning chill wrapped around him. He knew she needed time. But how long could the truth wait before it destroyed everything? The silence following their last meeting felt like a whirlwind of uncertainty for Alexander. Emma had taken the file with her, but since then he hadn't heard from her. How much did she know now? How many questions were circling in her mind? And most importantly, would she ever be willing to see him again? He tried to convince himself that giving her space was the right thing to do. Yet every evening, as the city sparkled below him, the urge to find her grew stronger. Finally, he couldn't bear the silence any longer. He decided to take action. The next morning, Alexander drove to the park, just as he had done for days. but the bench where she often sat was empty. He waited for a while, hoping she might appear, but after an hour he gave up. As he walked back to his car, a knot of worry tightened in his stomach. Where was she? Had he driven her away for good? That evening, as he placed his keys on the dresser and removed his coat, he heard a faint noise from the living room. He froze. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, as if someone was deliberately keeping quiet. Had he forgotten to lock the door, or was someone in his home? Alexander walked toward the living room, his heart pounding in his chest. When he stepped inside, he saw her. Emma was sitting in the shadows near the large glass windows, her slender figure barely illuminated by the city lights streaming in. Her coat hung loosely around her shoulders, and in her hands she held the file. "Emma," he said, his voice low and surprised, "how did you get in?" She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "The doorman let me in," she replied curtly. "Apparently you didn't tell him to keep me out." Alexander took a deep breath and cautiously sat in the chair across from her. "Why are you here?" he asked softly. "I thought you needed more time." Emma raised the file and dropped it onto the table. "I read what's in it," she said, her tone flat. "But what I don't understand is why you thought it was a good idea to keep this from me for so long." Alexander opened his mouth to respond, but she held up her hand. "Let me finish," she said sharply. "You knew what Joris did. You knew how it affected my life. But what bothers me the most—" Her voice wavered slightly, and she looked him directly in the eyes. "Is that you know more about my mother than you've told me. So now I'm asking, what else are you hiding from me?" Alexander rubbed his hands over his face, as though trying to summon the courage to answer. "You're right," he admitted at last. "There's more to tell. But it's complicated, Emma, and I don't know where to start." "Just start," she said, her tone firm. "I don't want half-truths anymore, Alexander. No more secrets." He swallowed hard and met her gaze, his eyes filled with regret. "My father was the one who closed your mother's cafe. It was part of a deal with Joris. A business decision, as they called it. But it went much further than that. The cafe wasn't just a business, it was your home. And when it was gone, it took everything from you." Emma froze, her gaze a mix of disbelief and anger. "So your family," she whispered, "didn't just take my mother's job. They took our home, our life." Alexander nodded slowly. "I didn't know at the time. I was too young. But when I got older and learned more about my father and Joris, I found out. And I never did anything to make it right." Her silence was unbearable. What was she thinking? What was she feeling? And how could he ever hope to make amends for what his family had caused? Emma stood, her face pale but her eyes blazing. "You knew, and you didn't tell me." Her voice trembled with restrained anger. "You let me think this was only about Joris when you and your family are just as guilty." "Emma, please," Alexander began, rising to his feet. "I didn't know how to tell you. I was afraid you'd never forgive me." "Forgive," she repeated, her voice sharp. "You have no idea what it's like to lose everything, and now you expect—" "What?" "That I'll understand. That I'll accept your apology." He took a step forward, his expression pleading. "I don't expect anything. I just want you to know that I care about you, that I'm trying, because I love you." His words hung heavily in the air. Emma remained standing, her hands clenched into fists, her breathing labored. "Love me?" she echoed, her voice barely a whisper. "How can you say that when you represent everything that destroyed me?" Alexander remained silent, unsure of what to say. Was this the moment he lost her forever? Emma turned, her shoulders tense. "I need to leave," she said curtly. "I don't know what to do with all of this. But one thing I do know. This changes everything." She walked to the door without giving him another glance. Alexander stayed behind, the weight of his words and secrets pressing heavily on his shoulders. Was this the end, or just the beginning of an even more painful chapter? The silence between them had lasted for days, but for Alexander it felt like weeks. Since their last meeting, he hadn't heard from Emma, and he forced himself to give her time. Still, no matter how often he convinced himself that this was the right decision, the unease refused to leave him. Had he ruined everything for good? He spent his evenings in an empty apartment, the city below an indifferent backdrop. As he stood by the window, he replayed their conversations in his mind. Her words, her pain, her anger. What could he possibly do to regain her trust? The answer came unexpectedly. Just as he was about to go to bed, a loud knock echoed through the door. The sound was firm, almost urgent. Alexander looked up, his heart skipping a beat. Who would visit him so late? He walked to the door and opened it cautiously. There she was, Emma. Her face was pale, her expression sharp and tired. She wore her familiar oversized coat and carried a bag slung over her shoulder, one he hadn't seen before. The tension between them was palpable. "Emma," he said, his voice softer than he intended, "what are you doing here?" She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her footsteps hard against the wooden floor. "We need to talk," she said curtly. Alexander closed the door and turned to face her. Emma stood in the middle of the living room, her arms crossed. Her gaze briefly swept over the luxurious furnishings, as if taking it all in. "You weren't expecting me," she began, her tone flat. "No," Alexander admitted, "but I'm glad you're here." Emma shook her head, her eyes remaining sharp. "I'm not here because I missed you," she said sharply. "I'm here because I want answers." "You still haven't told me everything." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. "Emma, I've told you everything I know." She gave a mocking smile. "Really? Because today I ran into someone who claims to know things you still haven't told me." Alexander stiffened. "Who?" he asked, his voice low. "Joris," she answered, her eyes narrowing. "He was waiting for me outside the shelter. He said I'd never get the full truth from you." Just hearing the name made Alexander's jaw tighten. What was Joris trying now? And how had he found Emma? "What exactly did he say?" Alexander asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Emma leaned against the edge of the table, her gaze fixed on him. "He said you're hiding things from me. That you're just as responsible for what happened to my mother as he is." Alexander felt a pang of frustration. "Emma, listen to me. Joris manipulates people. He says whatever he needs to in order to create division. You can't trust him." "And you?" she shot back. "Can I trust you, Alexander? You've already hidden things from me before." His breath caught. Her words hit a painful truth. "I understand why you feel that way," he said slowly, "but I've told you everything I know. Everything that matters." Emma shook her head, her lips trembling with restrained anger. "Joris said you knew exactly what your family did to us, that you've always known. Is that true?" Alexander looked her directly in the eyes, his expression filled with regret. "No," he said softly. "I didn't always know, but when I found out, I stayed silent for too long, and I regret that more than I can say." His words were honest, but Emma didn't seem convinced. What more could he do to win back her trust? Emma stood, her breathing uneven. "You say you love me, but how can I believe that when your family is the reason my mother and I lost everything?" "I know I'm not perfect," Alexander said, "but what I feel for you is real, and I'm willing to do anything to make it right, even if that means you'll never forgive me." Emma looked at him, her gaze softening slightly, but still filled with doubt. "Make it right," she repeated. "What does that even mean to you, Alexander? Throwing money at the problem to fix it? Or actually sharing my pain so it hurts less?" Alexander hesitated. Her words struck him deeper than he expected. "I don't know if I can ever make it right," he admitted, "but I want to try. Because you deserve more. Because you're stronger than anyone I've ever known." Emma's eyes flickered briefly, as though his words had touched a nerve. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. "I need time to think," she said finally. She turned and walked toward the door. Alexander followed, but kept his distance. "Emma," he said, just before she stepped outside, "know that I'm here, whatever you decide." She turned briefly to look at him. "I hope that's true," she said softly. "Because if I find out there's more, I'm gone. For good." The door closed quietly behind her, and Alexander was left standing in the silence of his apartment. He knew the next step would determine everything, not just for their relationship, but for how he would live with himself moving forward. The night after Emma's visit, Alexander barely slept. Her words echoed endlessly in his mind. If I find out there's more, I'm gone. For good. He knew she meant it. But how could he convince her that there was nothing else to uncover? Or worse, what if he was wrong? The next morning, he made a decision. He needed to confront Joris. If anyone could make this situation worse, it was Joris. And if there was anything Alexander didn't know, he needed to find out. Before Emma did. That afternoon, Alexander sat in a dimly lit cafe on the edge of the city. He had told Joris he wanted to talk. And as expected, Joris had agreed. Joris relished being in control, and Alexander knew this meeting would be no different. When Joris arrived, he smiled broadly, as if they were old friends. He wore a perfectly tailored suit and carried the arrogance Alexander had always despised. "Alexander," Joris said as he took a seat, "what a surprise. What can I do for you?" Alexander leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "I want you to leave Emma alone. Whatever you're trying to do, it stops now." Joris chuckled softly, taking a sip of coffee he hadn't even ordered. "You're always so direct, Alexander, but I don't think you understand how this game works. You see, Emma isn't just your problem. She's also a reminder of how easily you let your family's mistakes slide." "I already know that," Alexander said sharply, "but I want to know why you keep going after her. What do you want from her?" Joris grinned and leaned back in his chair. "Maybe I don't want anything from her," he said casually. "Maybe I just want to see how long it takes for her to realize who you really are." Alexander felt his stomach drop. What did Joris mean? What did he know that Alexander didn't? Joris pulled a file from his bag and dropped it onto the table with a loud thud. "You know," he said, running his hands over the file, "you might think you know everything. But there are always layers, Alexander. Secrets even the people closest to you have kept hidden." "What are you talking about?" Alexander asked, his voice low and threatening. Joris pushed the file toward him. "Open it," he said with a smug smile. "If you're so sure of your position, this shouldn't mean anything to you." Alexander hesitated, but his hands moved almost involuntarily toward the file. He opened it and began to read. The words on the pages froze his world. What he read wasn't just a threat to his relationship with Emma, it was a blow to everything he thought he knew about himself. That evening, Alexander sat in his penthouse, the file still on the table in front of him. The information inside revealed a piece of the past he had never known. His father hadn't just closed Emma's mother's cafe, he had met her personally. And worse, there had been a financial connection. His father had offered Emma's mother money to leave, but she had refused. Her refusal had made everything worse. The cafe wasn't just shut down, it was deliberately taken from her. Alexander felt a mix of disgust and regret. How could he tell Emma this? How could he show her that he wasn't like his father, when his name was inextricably tied to that past? The next day, he found her in the park. She was sitting on her usual bench, but her posture was more tense than usual. She looked up as he approached, her gaze cold. "What do you want now?" she asked before he could say anything. Alexander sat beside her, the file in his hand. "Emma," he began cautiously, "there's more. I know you told me you don't want any more lies, and I want to tell you everything. But first, I need you to listen." Her gaze flicked to the file. "What's that?" she asked. Alexander set it on the bench beside her. "It's what I got from Joris yesterday. It's about my father. And about your mother." Emma stiffened. She looked from him to the file and back again. "And what do you want me to do with it?" she asked sharply. "I want you to read it," Alexander said, "but I also want you to know that I didn't know what was in there until yesterday." Her gaze was hard, but there was a flicker of curiosity. What could be in that file that he was so hesitant to share? She opened the file slowly and began to read. Her breathing quickened as she went through the pages, her eyes scanning the words as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. When she finished, she looked at him, her face a mix of anger and pain. "So your father," she began, her voice trembling, "didn't just take my mother's job and home. He forced her to choose between her dignity and our survival." Alexander nodded, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. "I know this hurts you even more," he said softly. "But I need you to know that I'm not like him. I don't want to make this right because I have to. I want to because you deserve it." Emma stood, the file still in her hand. "You're not like him," she repeated. "Maybe not, but you carry his name, and everything your family did to us is still part of my past." She turned and walked away, her steps heavy. "I don't know if I can ever trust you, Alexander," she said as she left, "but one thing I know for sure, I won't just forget this." He stayed behind, feeling as though he had lost her all over again. But maybe, just maybe, he had given her something that could help her find her own strength. The days after Emma's departure felt like a silent grey mist spreading through Alexander's life. He spent most of his time in his penthouse, a place that had once been his sanctuary, but now felt like a cage. The silence weighed heavily on him. Every second without her felt like a failure, pressing harder on him with each passing moment. He had faced the truth. His father was the architect of the pain Emma and her mother had endured. But that truth felt like a knife cutting deeper. What would Emma do if she realized how much he had ignored all this time? Could she ever see him as more than the heir to the cruelty that had destroyed her life? The evening was quiet, the city below glittering in the darkness. Alexander stared at the skyline through the tall windows of his penthouse, his gaze empty. Over the past few days, his lawyer had sent him more documents, but nothing could have prepared him for what he had read that afternoon. An old letter, written by his father to Joris. The words were carefully chosen, chilling in their clarity. "The cafe is just the beginning. They'll adapt or they'll disappear. And that's nothing more than business evolution." Alexander felt his stomach turn. His father hadn't just acted ruthlessly. He had regarded the suffering of Emma's family as collateral damage, a necessary evil in the name of progress. How could he ever face Emma with this truth? His thoughts were interrupted by a loud knock at the door. Alexander froze. He wasn't expecting anyone, and at this hour, an unannounced visit was unusual. Slowly he walked to the door, his heart pounding. When he opened it, he saw her, Emma. She stood there, her small frame wrapped in that familiar, oversized coat. Her face was tense, but her eyes betrayed a mix of emotions. Anger, sadness, and something that almost looked like hope. "May I come in?" she asked curtly, without looking at him. Alexander stepped aside and gestured toward the living room. She walked in, her steps purposeful, and stopped near the large windows. The skyline reflected in the glass as she spoke. "So," she began, her voice firm, "you have more to tell me. I can feel it. And I'm here to hear it. All of it." Alexander walked toward her slowly, but stopped a few feet away. "Emma," he started cautiously, "you're right. There is more. But it's not easy to say." "That's your problem," she said sharply, turning to face him. "My entire life has been built on lies and half-truths. If I mean anything to you, say it now. Or don't say anything at all." Her words hit harder than he had expected. He felt the weight of the moment pressing on his chest like a stone. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his father's letter and held it out to her. "This," he said, his voice breaking, "is what I need to show you." Emma hesitated, but eventually took the letter. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it and began to read. Her face hardened as her eyes moved over the lines. When she finished, she looked up, her breathing heavy. "So your father," she began, her voice filled with disbelief. "He saw us as nothing, less than nothing, just an obstacle." Alexander nodded, his head bowed. "I didn't know this existed until a few days ago," he said softly. "But I know that doesn't matter. This is what he did. This is what your family had to endure because of him." Emma still held the letter, her grip tightening. "And you?" she asked, her voice sharp now. "What did you do, Alexander, when you found out? When you learned what your family had done to us?" He met her gaze, his eyes filled with regret. "I did nothing," he admitted. "I was afraid to face it all. But that changes now. I want to make this right, Emma, no matter what it takes." She turned back to the skyline, her expression bitter. "Make it right," she repeated. "How do you fix something that's already broken? My mother is dead, Alexander. Our lives were irreparably changed because of your father. What can you possibly do about that now?" Alexander took a step closer, his voice steady. "I don't know how to make it right," he said, "but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. My name, my money, my company. If that's what it takes to show you I'm different, then I'll do it." Emma turned to face him slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You think sacrifices will fix everything?" she asked, her voice sharp but fragile. "It's not about what you give up, Alexander. It's about who you are. And I still don't know if I can trust you." Her words cut through the air like a knife. Would he ever be able to prove his sincerity to her? Emma placed the letter carefully on the table and took a deep breath. "I'm not here to forgive you," she said finally. "I don't know if I ever can. But I want one thing from you." Alexander looked at her, his heart pounding. "What do you want?" he asked. She met his gaze, her voice trembling but resolute. "Honesty. No excuses, no lies. Just the truth, Alexander, even if it hurts me." He nodded slowly, his throat dry. "You'll get nothing less," he promised. "I swear it." Emma looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Then she turned and walked toward the door. "We'll see," she said softly, before leaving the penthouse. Alexander stood there, alone with the letter and the weight of her words. This was his chance, but how could he repair a past that had caused so much harm? That night, Alexander barely slept again. Emma's words echoed in his mind. "I want the truth, even if it hurts me." She hadn't left in anger, at least not entirely, but the distance between them felt greater than ever. Morning broke with a grey sky and the threat of rain. Alexander stood by the large window of his penthouse, the letter from his father still on the table behind him. What more could he do to regain her trust? How do you prove to someone that you're more than the mistakes of your past? That afternoon, he received a call from his lawyer. "Alexander," the man began in a heavy tone, "I've gone through everything as you asked, but I have to warn you, what I found makes this even more complicated." "What do you mean?" Alexander asked immediately. "There are more documents," the lawyer explained. "It seems Joris and your father didn't just close the cafe. They also reached a financial agreement with Emma's mother, something that made her feel like she had no other choice." Alexander's breath caught. "What kind of agreement?" "I'm sending it to you now," the lawyer said. "You need to read it for yourself." A few minutes later, Alexander received the files. His heart pounded as he scanned the documents. The agreement was clear. His father had offered Emma's mother a settlement, money in exchange for silence. But what made the deal truly devastating was the threat buried within it. If she refused, her situation would only worsen. His father had backed Emma's mother into a corner with no way out. Everything Emma and her mother had endured had been calculated, deliberate. Alexander knew he had to share this with Emma, no matter how painful it was. But before he could call her or go to her, he was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Carter, there's a man here to see you. He says his name is Joris." Alexander's grip on the receiver tightened. "Send him up," he said. What did Joris want now? Had he heard that Alexander was digging into the past again? A few minutes later, Joris stood in the penthouse living room. He carried his usual arrogance like a second skin, but there was something threatening in his eyes. "Alexander," Joris began with a mocking smile, "I hear you're busy reopening old wounds. Do you really think that will get you anywhere?" Alexander gestured to the couch. "Say what you want to say, Joris. Why are you here?" Joris sat down, folding his hands casually. "I'm here to warn you," he said. "Emma is stronger than you think, but she's also vulnerable. If you keep heading down this self-destructive path, she'll discover the truth. And believe me, she won't thank you for it." "What truth?" Alexander asked sharply. "I've told her everything." Joris laughed, but it was a cold sound. "Have you really? Does she know how much you knew before you even met her? Or are you keeping that detail hidden for now?" Alexander froze. Was Joris right? Had he already failed Emma's trust by not being fully transparent about how he'd stepped into her life? After Joris left, Alexander felt like the walls of his penthouse were closing in on him. He knew he had to go to Emma to tell her everything. But what if he was too late? What if the truth pushed her further away than she already was? That evening, as the rain softly pattered against the windows, he decided to take the risk. He knew where Emma was staying. Gathering the documents, he left. When he arrived at the shelter, a pang of regret hit him. The place was small, simple, and worlds apart from the life he knew. But Emma deserved more than his regret. She deserved the truth. He found her sitting outside on a worn bench under a broken light. She didn't look up as he approached, but her posture stiffened when he sat beside her. "Emma," he began carefully, "I know I've already asked too much of you, but there's something else I need to show you." She slowly turned her head toward him, her gaze cold. "What now, Alexander? What more could you possibly reveal?" Without a word, he handed her the documents. She opened them, her eyes scanning the pages with increasing speed. When she finished, she let the papers fall onto her lap. "So," she said bitterly, "your father didn't just ruin my mother, he threatened her, and you waited until now to share this with me." "I only discovered this today," Alexander said softly, "and I didn't want to hide it any longer. You deserve the truth." "The truth?" she repeated, her voice fragile. "The truth is that your family drove my mother to despair. And now you want… what? To fix it all? To think that apologies will make it right?" Alexander looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I don't know if I can ever make it right, Emma, but I want to try, no matter what it takes." Emma stood, her face set. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Alexander," she said quietly, "but I do know that I need to choose myself, not you, not your guilt." She turned and walked away, the documents still in her hand. Alexander remained seated, the rain slowly dripping from the broken light above him. He knew the next step was hers to take. But what would she decide? The rain softly tapped against the windows of Alexander's penthouse as he stood by the large window, staring down at the city below. The skyline had once given him a sense of power, of control. But now it felt like an empty stage, a mirror reflecting the man he used to be. Emma's words echoed in his mind. "I need to choose for myself." How many times had he replayed that sentence in his head, trying to understand what it meant, not for her, but for himself? The past few weeks had changed him more than he ever thought possible. He was no longer the man who believed that money and power could solve everything. Emma had taught him that. She had shown him that true value lies in people, in choices, not possessions. But what did that mean now, especially if she never came back? That afternoon, Alexander decided to take his next step. He drove to the shelter. He hadn't dared to go there since their last meeting, but now he knew he had to. He had no plans, no grand gesture, just the truth and the hope that she might hear it. When he arrived, she was outside, just as he had hoped. She sat on a bench under an old tree, her face fixed ahead as if she were observing something invisible. Her coat was the same as always, but her posture had changed. She no longer looked lost. She looked like someone who had found her way. Alexander walked toward her slowly. She only looked up when he was standing right in front of her. "You're here," she said simply, her voice holding no surprise. "I had to come," he replied softly. "I wanted to see you." Emma turned slightly away, her gaze fixed on the bare branches above them. "Why? To give me more documents to read, to reveal more secrets?" Alexander shook his head. "No, I'm not here to hide anything or explain. I'm here because I realize I need to do things differently. I want to listen, Emma, not talk." Emma's lips curled slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Listen," she repeated, "that's new." Alexander smiled faintly. "I know, it took me too long to understand that I don't need to fix everything. Sometimes I just need to be." She turned to face him, her gaze sharp. "And what does that mean to you, Alexander? What does it mean to be?" He was silent for a moment, considering her question. "It means that I no longer define myself by my name or my money," he finally said. "I thought I could add value by doing things, by giving things. But now I see that I needed to understand myself first, and that only started when I met you." Emma looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. "So you think you've changed?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "I know I have, but I also know I still make mistakes, that I still have a long way to go. The only thing I know for certain is that I want to be different. Not for you, but because of you." Emma stood, her arms loosely crossed. "And what do you want now, Alexander?" she asked, her voice softer than before. "Do you think you can keep showing up, apologizing and hoping everything will be okay again. Alexander looked at the ground and took a deep breath. "No," he said, "I know I can't expect anything, but I do want to do something, not to save myself, but because your mother and you deserve more than what my family took from you." Emma remained silent, her gaze searching. "And how do you plan to do that?" He pulled a set of keys from his pocket and handed her a small worn key. Emma looked at him puzzled. "The cafe," he said. "I bought it. Not for me, but for you. I want you to decide what happens to it, whether you rebuild it, close it, or do something entirely different. It's yours, Emma." She stared at the key, her breathing uneven. "And you?" she asked finally. "What does this mean for you?" Alexander smiled faintly. "For me, it means I'm finally doing something that feels truly right. Not to pay off a debt, not as a grand gesture, just a step toward fixing what never should have happened." Emma looked at the key in her hand as if it carried a weight she couldn't yet comprehend. Finally, she slipped it into her pocket and looked at him. "This doesn't mean everything is okay," she said. "I still don't know if I can fully trust you." "I know," Alexander said, "but this isn't about me, it's about you." Her eyes glistened briefly before she looked away. "I'll think about it," she said finally, "and if I decide to rebuild the cafe, I'll do it alone. No help, no interference." Alexander nodded. "That's exactly what I hoped for." Weeks, then months later, Alexander stood in his penthouse, staring out at the city again. But this time it felt different. He had let go of something that had held him back for too long. He was no longer the man who thought he could control everything. He was someone who had learned to let go and to rediscover himself. One day he received a simple envelope in the mail. No name, no address. Inside was a short note, written in a graceful but firm handwriting. "The cafe opens in a month. You're welcome, but only as a customer." Alexander smiled. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. And sometimes a beginning is all you need. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment below, and share your thoughts with us.